And to help us delve deeper into the result of the summit in Hanoi, we are joined by Dr. Bong Young-shik again. He's a senior researcher at the Yonsei Institute for North Korean Studies, and our reporter Cha Sang-mi is joining us in the studio for this session. Thank you for being here with us.
You're welcome.
Well, first of all, the outcome of the summit, we've been talking about it before and during the previous session. Many people have negative response to it, that it was a failure, but Dr. Bong, you understand there is a silver lining to it.
Right, I'm hesitant to call it a failure. It can be called failure in terms of not producing an agreement, but this is a good failure in terms of the United States and North Korea not signing on an agreement that is empty and meaningless. So in that regard, exchanging very candid opinions about what they respectively wanted was very beneficial in this second summit meeting in Hanoi between US President Donald Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un of North Korea. So I would assert that rather than signing a bad deal, walking away from it is a better choice.
But somehow it seems like whatever President Trump decides to do, whether he signs a bad deal or don't sign a bad deal, or he signs any deal, there's a negative skepticism from home in the United States.
Well, I would say that that's kind of a perception President Trump himself is holding. But at the same time, it seems like he's a very positive personality. So every agreement he regards, if I just imitate him, enormous or usually successful anyway, with or without praise or criticism. So I'm sure that President himself would regard with no doubt that it was the absolutely right decision for him to walk away from a deal that would have been very poor and problematic.
Brimming with optimism and confidence, that's the reason why he was elected president, one big reason why he was a favorite. Also interestingly, we usually see him wear his emotions on his shirt. It was a little different this time around, more subdued and controlled, whether it's before or after the summit.
Right. That means that he gained a deeper understanding of Mr. Kim Jong-un as a person and North Korea as a system, as well as issues on the table, including how to achieve denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula and building endurable peace regime and normalization of a relationship between two adversaries since the time of the Korean War, the United States and North Korea. More knowledge implies that he does not get gravitated toward showing emotions at the podium.
It seems like he had a very simple game plan to follow: denuclearization or else.
Right. Denuclearization as defined, his way. In his speech, answer to the question from the floor during the press conference, he made it really clear that denuclearization means to him getting rid of nuclear weapons inside North Korea, period. And North Korean leadership showed no interest in giving the kind of denuclearization to President Donald Trump in the exchange of lifting all economic sanctions.
Sang-mi, could you walk us back to the four pillars that was included in the joint statement that was harshly scrutinized after they were reached in Singapore?
Right. The landmark summit between the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and U.S. President Donald Trump was in June 12 last year in Singapore, as you said. And there were the four pillars that they discussed. First was, of course, establishing a new relationship between the two countries. And second, of course, was to work towards creating lasting peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. And of course, the most important was for North Korea to work towards complete denuclearization. And then the fourth but not least, was, of course, to discuss the POW and missing in actions of those U.S. soldiers who died in the Korean War.
Right, and it seems like North Korea delivered on a lot of the promises made in terms of sending the remains of the war dead and whatnot.
Right. Actually, last July, the North Koreans, they sent 55 boxes of those remains, and they were successfully transferred to Hawaii for identification. And they were resuming these talks, actually, about this repatriation. But then now with this deal that they have not reached together, we still do not know exactly what is going to be the next talks about this.
Right. Dr. Bong, we understand that using North Korea's limited resources and technology, it was very difficult for them to even get to that point in terms of meeting the summit agreements, retrieving or finding the bodies. But certainly, North Korea has been showing willingness to change its ways and less animosity towards the United States for sure recently, right?
Right, but it is one thing that North Korean leadership and its people show less, hostility toward the United States as adversary, and it is another that's a genuine transformation of North Koreans' attitude toward the United States. First one is tactical, and the other one is fundamental. So unless there will be a official normalization of diplomatic relations between North Korea and the United States, then we can't really say with 100% confidence that animosity toward the United States inside North Korea has been either lessened or even eliminated.
So looking from the inside out, from North Korea's perspective, do they feel they've been shortchanged in terms of making these drastic changes but not getting what they want from the U.S. in return?
Well, the reality on the Korean Peninsula has not been changed since 1953, when the Armistice Agreement was signed. Still, North Korea and the United States, and North Korea and South Korea, are facing each other as main enemies, although the white paper of the Ministry of National Defense of South Korea deleted that definition of North Korea. But the reality remains the same. I would like to highlight that point. And one of the anticipated goal of this Hanoi summit meeting between U.S. and North Korea was exactly that: how to end the enduring hostility on the confrontation on the Korean Peninsula by agreeing on some kind of a declaration of peace or declaration of official end of the Korean War. But obviously, that agenda was not top priority for at least North Korean leadership, Mr. Kim Jong-un, because when the reporter asked a question at the outset of the extended summit meeting, Mr. Kim Jong-un simply answered that those ideas are welcoming, but it was apparent that his focus was entirely on how to persuade his counterpart, U.S. President Donald Trump, about lifting economic sanctions in their entirety.
It seemed both sides were very careful and they seemed to try and do more of their homework before they sat down for talks this time around.
One thing that I'm puzzled is why Chairman Kim Jong-un, if the content of a press conference conducted by U.S. President is 100% correct, why Mr. Kim Jong-un did not even try to slice its demand about lifting economic sanctions, right? It seems like Mr. Kim insists on lifting economic sanctions by the United States in its entirety. It's all or nothing approach. Then if North Korea is insistent upon all or nothing toward the United States, then it is expected that the United States would respond in the same way, all or nothing. Yongbyon would be far from sufficient in the line of all or nothing strategy. So it was only natural of President Trump and his team to demand something really big. Yongbyon, beyond Yongbyon, inspection and dismantlement of nuclear facilities, not only inside Yongbyon, as proposed by Mr. Kim Jong-un, but other areas designated by the United States. So my question is why? What made Mr. Kim Jong-un so myopic, so preoccupied with demanding lifting all economic sanctions, not just some economic sanctions in exchange for some measures of denuclearization? I can't really explain as of now what accounts for this rigid approach by Mr. Kim Jong-un at the Hanoi summit meeting.
Right. If it was just even a partial agreement, if they negotiated on this, and for instance, they had really agreed to exchange liaison offices as they discussed earlier, that would be a quasi-embassies in their own capitals, and that would have really improved their relationship, which would have been the first step to normalizing their relations as well.
Right, political normalization before they could talk about denuclearization, but of course, we understand that that could be a very dangerous approach in terms of dealing with North Korea, right?
Why is it dangerous?
Denuclearization, political normalization before denuclearization could mean that we accept North Korea as a nuclear state.
Not necessarily. I mean, you can normalize your relations as a way of ending the history of hostility. So denuclearization would be dealt separately.
Separately, but of course, the Trump administration would love to see that dealt with first and foremost above all.
Right, right. But still, the problem for me is that United States offering that normalization of relations in a very low level, opening liaison office. Because opening liaison office is not really determined by the head of the state, by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of each country. So it's a very low level of process toward full diplomatic relations. So in exchange for low level of normalization, the North Korea and the United States would have agreed upon low level of denuclearization in return. That didn't happen. That didn't even seriously considered by Kim and Trump. That puzzles me.
It feels like both leaders were on the same frequency in terms of thinking, go big or go home. And they both decided to go home this time. Well, for North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, he will still be in Vietnam. Speaking of which, he has more schedule left for, I believe, 2 more days of visits in Vietnam, a state visit?
Right. Kim Jong-un actually, the Vietnamese foreign ministry actually just told us that Kim Jong-un will be making the official state visit that they have been talking about starting tomorrow for 2 days. And then for tomorrow, he will be meeting with the Vietnamese president. And then he will also be joining the banquet with the president. And then on Saturday, he will meet with the prime minister of Vietnam. And he will be actually visiting the mausoleum of Ho Chi Minh, who is the founding president of the country. He will also likely be visiting some of the touristy sites in Vietnam, which are very famous for its industrial reforms. When we look back at Vietnam's history a little bit, in 1986, there was this important Doi Moi reform, which Doi would mean change, Moi means new, so a renovation, a new reform. It opened, the country opened its market to capitalism, and then the economy started booming, but not until 1995 when the country, Vietnam, normalized relations with the United States, and they signed a bilateral agreement in 2000. So since then, their economy actually have been really humming.
Right. Let's focus on the issue of normalizing their relations since the Korean War. It might be just coincidence in human history, but especially in modern times. Countries tend to experience great prosperity, economic growth, as well as secure external environment once they settle their relations with the United States. Countries that succeed in reconciliation with the United States happen to be very successful in modernization and the political stability. Look at Germany and Japan. Countries defeated by the United States in the Second World War. Look at Germany and Japan. They are one of the most trustworthy countries to the United States, but they fought the World War with the United States. Vietnam, as you mentioned, that Vietnam seems to be a very attractive case to study for North Korea to follow. Reconcile its relations with the United States, engage in Doi Moi, a renovation policy. And now Vietnam is a country to be counted, even among ASEAN member countries. China, after détente during the Nixon and Carter administrations, now China is number 2 economy in the world, and the Chinese Communist Party has not lost its power since then. Must be a very attractive case also to Kim Jong-un. Then why Kim Jong-un did not really focus on discussing path toward normalization with the United States if it wants political stability as well as long-term economic growth? That puzzles me. Why he was blindly focused on demanding economic sanction reliefs all the way. That shows lack of flexibility or multidimensional strategic thinking for Chairman Kim Jong-un at this Hanoi summit meeting. One hypothesis is that the pains created by economic sanctions are now too much to bear. So he was desperate. There are signs that he was so desperate and in a rush, right? He mentioned that every minute counts, right? We are in the middle of conversation. But still, showing your desperation or showing emotions is a no-no at the negotiation table. It's a negotiation 101. That shows Kim Jong-un may not be so well prepared to deal with President Donald Trump. Maybe he overestimated the personal chemistry or the overblown, arrogant personality of the US president as his asset to be exploited. But this time, as you said, that President Trump seems to be very collected, even at the stage 4 press conference.
Even at the press conference, what stood out most for me, among other things that President Trump touched on, is the fact that when they asked about, will there be further sanctions, he said no. There will be no further sanctions. The sanctions that are in place are strong enough. And he actually accentuated the fact that there are people living in North Korea suffering because of the sanctions, which I found to be quite interesting.
He was well briefed and well educated prior to actually walking into this summit meeting in terms of preparing to answer very tough questions, including whether sanctions are hurting innocent people inside North Korea. He had his own answer. In response to the question whether human rights violations inside North Korea had been discussed, he also had an answer. He knew what kind of demands, very specific demands for inspections inside North Korea for denuclearization, in coordination with his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. He made a very specific demands to North Korea, which surprised the North Korean negotiation team. So one leader seems to be well prepared. The other leader seems to be caught in emotion and high expectation.
It seems like perhaps this time around it was a new kind of Donald Trump that came to the negotiating table, stirring up somewhat of a confusion and change of pace, the necessity for a change of pace for the North Korean side.
I think the reason why President Trump was well prepared and calm and collected was that despite all the political turmoils that he was surrounded at home, he knew very clearly that sanctions work. As long as you hold on to economic sanctions, you have upper hand over North Korea.
So very quickly, before we wrap things up, Sang-mi, what about the economic cooperation between the two Koreas? What's President Moon Jae-in's next move from here on, other than communicating with the U.S. leader?
Right. I mean, just as we talked about, the sanctions relief, if the sanctions relief it doesn't work out, then there is no joint cooperation or cooperative projects between the two Koreas. But, initially they were talking about a lot of projects, including the railway connection that actually they can connect all the way to Moscow through the Trans-Siberian Railway. They were talking about the Kaesong Industrial Complex and also resuming the Kumgangsan Mountain tours. And all these things were actually a lot of economic benefits for North Korea. But now everything is up in the air. We do not know what is going to happen to these projects.
We have to keep in mind that the Treasury Department of the United States government may impose serious punishment, punitive measures on South Korean companies and banks if they violate the United States unilateral economic sanctions on North Korea, as well as a violation of the United Nations Security Council resolutions, such as the Article 18 of the United Nations Security Council resolution number 2371, which prohibits any new joint ventures to be forged between North Korea and other countries. And United Nations Security Council Resolution 2397 prohibits supply of oil over the limit imposed by the resolution, as well as supply of heavy machinery to be used in construction inside North Korean territories. Sanctions are really tough. There have been 10 United Nations Security Council resolutions since Kim Jong-un engaged in provocation in the form of missile and nuclear tests. 10 United Nations Security Council resolutions remain in place. So it is North Korea that has to come up with some kind of big bang, big changes that would persuade the United States to lead other countries and the United Nations Security Council to either suspend or weaken or even abrogate the existing UN Security Council resolutions upon North Korea. And Kim Jong-un miserably failed this time.
What is the difference compared to, other than the leadership in North Korea, compared to a time when there were six-party talks fueling hopes of denuclearized North Korea compared to this time around in terms of negotiations?
During the time of six-party talks, it seems like ancient times, it was purported to be, I wouldn't say easy, but doable to persuade North Korean leadership to abandon nuclear weapons and missiles, because the capability of North Korea's nuclear weapons and the delivery system were not one of the most sophisticated or highest levels enough to reach long-range targets such as the mainland of the United States or the nuclear bombs. Now, Dr. Sid Hacker witnessed in 2010 about 2,000 centripetal separators in Yongbyon, and the number of the separators seems to have increased by 2 times at least, 4,000. It is believed that there are almost or even over 18,000 the separators for the purpose of the enriching uranium in North Korea. So think about the total number of nuclear bombs North Korea is hiding today. So the task is high today. So during the six-party talks, the hope was high because eliminating those nuclear warheads and missiles that North Korea possessed could be negotiated or bargained with a low price. But because North Korea's capability has increased so much, then the calling price for North Korea is also naturally very high.
Well, they probably feel it was a worthwhile investment now that they're
Exactly.
using it as a very strong bargaining chip. And
Exactly.
they're therefore making a very difficult choice for them to relinquish it.
Right. But at the same time, the premise of precipitating the missile development and nuclear test was to actually prepare the negotiations like this with the United States. As a nuclear power state that could pose direct and grave threat to the United States. The North Korean leadership calculated that they would bargain with the United States from the position of power. But here came new president, Mr. Donald Trump, who behaved just like North Koreans. Maximum pressure and maximum engagement. Rather than succumb to the pressure from North Korea, armed with very sophisticated nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. Every time North Korea conducted a nuclear missile test, Trump administration, rather than try to bargain away the weapons acquired by North Korea, United States increased the pressure of economic sanctions. So nuclear weapons and missiles stop being the mechanisms that are beneficial to North Korean state and its people. Nuclear warheads and long-range missiles suddenly became mechanisms that enhance the pains and sufferings of North Korean people during the time of Trump administration. Maximum pressure.
Right.
So, which puts the North Korean leadership and its people in the very tough situation to make a choice between living with nuclear weapons and missiles while suffering, or you give up nuclear weapons and missiles and choose economic prosperity.